Hello and welcome to South Asia Chat, a podcast series brought to you by the Institute of South Asian Studies at the National University of Singapore. I'm your host, Nithya Subramanian, an editor at the Institute. The Quad, a grouping comprising the United States, India, Australia, and Japan, has been growing in prominence in the recent years. The leaders held their first Quad summit earlier this month. This has happened within a few months of Joe Biden becoming president, indicating a continuation of Trump's policy. While vaccine cooperation was a key takeaway, there were several other decisions. To discuss more, we have with us Dr. Yogesh Joshi, Research Fellow at ISS. He's been following these developments quite closely. Thank you for joining us today, Dr. Joshi.
Glad to be here, Nithya. Thank you so much.
The first Quad summit featuring leaders of the United States, India, Australia, and Japan was held on 12th March. Just prior to that, the foreign ministers of these countries met. At his press briefing, the United States National Security Advisor Jake Sullivan called it historic. Do you agree with this? And what, according to you, were the key takeaways from this meeting? Do you also think this has been a reinforcement of the US's commitment to the Indo-Pacific region?
Thanks, Nithya, for that question. I think one has to start with, in my understanding, there are four key takeaways. One is directly linked to Blinken's idea of this Quad summit as historic. And it is historic primarily because the Quad has finally resolved its historic hesitancy. In coming together at that level. So if we remember, the whole exercise began as an international humanitarian response to the tsunami in December 2004. And then on with the Manila summit of the Asian Regional Forum, the 4 or 5 navies, because Singapore was also participant at that point in time, came together. And then it dissipated pretty quickly, almost for a decade. Until 2017, when the foreign ministers of these 4 countries came together. So in some sense, the journey of Quad has been pretty long and full of hesitancies from all sides, particularly Australia, India. And on the other hand, Japan and US have been constant supporters. So in some sense, the Quad summit kind of indicates that now all the 4 countries, in some sense, are at the same wavelength when it comes to generally accepting that Quad is here to stay and that it needs to be coordinated at the highest levels. The second important turn, which I foresee, is the geo-economic turn, because Quad otherwise has always been judged, both internally and externally, by the intensity and level of security cooperation between these 4 countries. So whether all countries would participate in Malabar exercises or not, what level of naval cooperation would be there, whether they have signed the foundational defense agreements, whether there is defense cooperation. So I think there was an exorbitant amount of emphasis which was laid down on the military and the defense dynamics behind Quad, and maybe rightly so, but what it missed was a geo-economic angle, and primarily because all the 4 countries of the Quad are enmeshed in a very strong economic interdependence with China. China's rise and China's growth actually occurred on the shoulders of liberal economic patterns based upon its economic trade with all these countries, in a sense. So basically their growth also fueled China's growth, which now kind of is exhibited in its military rise. So unless you have some kind of an economic alternative to China, thinking about just military balances of power is futile. So I think this summit, particularly on its geo-economic emphasis with vaccines, with rare earths, it kind of shows that Quad is now finally looking at to creating an alternative economic model vis-a-vis China. The third is American leadership. Now, I have very mixed feelings about the Trump administration. There's so many things which were wrong with Trump's domestic policies, but I think in standing up to China in the way Trump did, as well as forcing allies to kind of take security concerns in the region seriously. I think those were Trump's biggest, in some sense, contributions to a balance of power in the Indo-Pacific. Yes, there were downsides. It was very transactional. It also created some apprehensions in the minds of the allies of American credibility, as well as it also kind of created, in some sense, a very difficult situation for countries, small countries, and countries in ASEAN, because they were now put into a corner. I think what Biden administration is trying to do is not to take away the offensive, edge of Trump's policies, but just sugarcoat it well with emphasizing upon its relationship with allies, emphasizing upon economic interdependence, emphasizing upon global governance. So in some sense, American leadership is back with the same offensive punch which you could see during the Trump's time. But lastly, I think what is most important at a very broad level is to understand that these patterns of balances of power, which you could see actually starting from early 2000, during George W. Bush, when he came to presidency, the first agenda item in George W. Bush's presidency was to take upon China. But that whole mode of balance of power was overtaken by events like 9/11, Iraq War, and all of that. And then you see America catching up. But also that China's rise led to anxieties among regional powers. And you see a kind of, a pattern of groupings forming around, these anxieties, geopolitical anxieties, which is now in some sense much more in a concrete form. So those geopolitical patterns are manifesting themselves much more prominently today, and we would see this to continue as the balance of power, or as the power dynamics in the region kind of manifests itself more clearly in terms of on one side being hedged to China, on the other side being led by the US.
So would it be right in assuming or in concluding that the Quad will not be an aspirational NATO as China, some people in China view it, but would also be used to develop softer capabilities?
So look, when China talks about NATO, it's definitely to, send aspirations to delegitimize the Quad. And all countries do that. It's not very specific to China, so to say. You're never going to legitimize an adversarial coalition. But I think there are fundamental differences between NATO and Quad. And there are three major differences, which I think, first of all, NATO and Quad doesn't compare in terms of primary threat which motivated these coalitions, at least not right now. So the level of the Soviet threat in the post-Second World War is not the level of the Chinese threat at this point in time. And we can't say whether it will develop into that kind of a threat or not, but much more depends upon China's actions and how it aims to utilize its power in the years to come. The second idea is American commitment and capacity. So NATO has full American commitment and the capacity of the US at that point in time. It doesn't compare right now, both in terms of American commitments and its capacity. You can't compare America of 1945 in Europe compared to America of 2020 in the Indo-Pacific. And lastly is about allies' commitment and capacity. So you again can't compare European nations with India, Japan, and Australia. They have huge amount of commitment because they're, primarily in terms of capacity, not in terms of commitment. They have similar interests at stake, but the capacity of these countries is huge compared to Germany, France, or England at that point in time. So I think this is substantially, there's a substantial difference. But two things I would say over here. First is, what are coalitions of the willing or alliances for that matter? I think one thing one must understand is that Quad is not an active deterrent. It's a deterrent in the making. So you're basically trying to tell China is, look, we will come together as we face more and more pressure from you. And it's a way to communicate to China that you should basically amend your actions. Otherwise, you will lead to a more cohesive alliance-like grouping. So it is for China to take that signal and alter its behavior accordingly. And if China does that, I don't see Quad becoming a NATO at some point in time, because it all ultimately depends upon, in some sense or the other, Chinese actions. So it's a deterrent in being, deterrent rather than an actual deterrent, so to say. And second is the issue of, alliances depend upon either credibility of commitment or uncertainty of commitment. So you can say that whether NATO is, would be effective if there is a credible commitment from the US, or would it be ineffective? I think the point which the Quad basically tells China is that, look, you don't know how we will react. And that uncertainty would create deterrence against China. So I think in that sense, there is a fundamental difference between NATO and the US and the NATO and the Quad. But it doesn't mean that these, the commitments won't become binding, or states won't agree to binding commitments in future. Again, this is all depends upon the interaction of Chinese power with anxieties of these rising powers. So we can never predict the future, so to say. But I think let's think about India's approach to what it gains from Quad, which is the most interesting part. And I'm just focusing on India because the other three blocks in the group are treaty allies in some sense about it. And I think that India's logic is of internal balancing. So Quad helps India to get arms, technology, and wealth to create those resources to balance China internally. The second thing is that it allows it to cooperate with these countries in isolating China's diplomatically and geopolitically. So whether it is connectivity projects, whether it is vaccines, whether it is supply chains, whether it is technological issues like rare earth or 5G, or capacity building among ASEAN countries or other small island states. It just allows India more resources, more space to actually take upon China, which it would not have otherwise done by its own. So I think that's the fundamental, nature, or the fundamental aspect of the Quad, which India which is of advantage to India. As far as the neighbors are concerned, I think, look, at the end of the day, geographical proximity induces fear, and that is the same for India. Neighbors feared India as much as they did during India's independence as they do today. And that is very typical of all small states confronting a large power, because of fundamental uncertainty in thinking about the larger power's behavior in the future. The same is the case with China. The same is the case with America. So I think that's a very natural. But one of the things which is very interesting is that these small states are not typically at the mercy of these large powers. They can also play their own games, and extract maximum benefits out of a situation of strategic flux, which they are doing today. When you see, how states like Nepal, Bangladesh, not Bhutan so much, but Sri Lanka, Pakistan for that matter, to a large extent, kind of play India and China to extract benefits for them, which is very, very natural, and they should do so. The problem would be when India and China, or China and these larger powers would enter into a very serious confrontation or a relationship which is prone to crisis. And then is where, small states would have to choose. And that's their problem. They don't really want to confront that. But at some point in time, if the geopolitics carry on the same trajectory, that would be, a place where they would not like to be.
Moving on to one of the major announcements that happened after the meeting, it was the Vaccine Alliance. And India is expected to play a prominent role here with its manufacturing capabilities. How do you think this would position the Quad and India's place within this grouping?
So vaccines have become, in some sense, the new geopolitical flag in some sense or the other. Particularly in the COVID-19 world, it not only has become essential for diplomatic influence, but also about status of who is actually providing more relief to the world and who has the capacity to do so. And I think this is where fundamentally Quad's vaccine push comes into being. Now, India is by far the biggest manufacturer of vaccines. So if you actually look, there are four major vaccines which India has either developed or is developing. One is AstraZeneca, Serum Institute, Covishield, the Bharat Biotech, which is producing indigenous one, which is producing Covaxin. Now, the Russian Sputnik vaccine would be produced by Gland Pharma in India. And Johnson & Johnson, the single-shot vaccine, would be manufactured in cooperation with an Indian pharma company called Biological E. Now, one needs to understand the numbers, first of all. So if you look at India's production and application of vaccines, it has produced something like over 130 million doses of vaccines. And out of which around over 70 million have been supplied for domestic use, but around 60 million, which is around 50% of the vaccines produced so far, have been exported, either for free distribution among neighbors or supplied on a bilateral basis to specific countries like Brazil, UAE, and others. But also a huge chunk has gone under the UN-led COVAX program. So India has already been at the forefront. What Quad does is that it bolsters India's capacity to take upon China's influence operations through, using vaccines as a mode to kind of, first of all, rebuild its image, which in some sense was, fundamentally there was some loss in reputation coming from how China managed the pandemic in initial times, but also to kind of reinforce China's influence operations in all over the world. What Quad does is, so how the distribution of work, I think this is the way they have distributed the work among themselves. One is that Japan, US, and Australia will provide the money. US will provide the technology, which is the J&J vaccinations, Johnson & Johnson vaccinations being produced in India. Australia will provide with transport facilities, and India will basically manufacture and produce this. So there are three conclusions which come out of this. One is that this is a new model of cooperation based on their comparative advantage. And it also, again, as I initially said, this is the geo-economic turn. So you basically want to tell to the world that it is not as if China is the only factory in the world. Quad countries can actually replace China if they want to. The second is that it helps to keep in check China's influence operations, all over the world, so to say. And lastly, it provides some kind of a signal to small states and particularly the ASEAN countries that, look, we are not here just to put you in a corner, but to kind of provide you alternatives when it comes to, your situation vis-a-vis your economic interdependence on China and your security dependence upon us. So I think those are the three major signals which this whole vaccine diplomacy kind of sends.
Thank you so much. That was a wonderful elaboration of the vaccine diplomacy. But moving away from vaccines, the Quad leaders also agreed to form working groups on issues of critical technologies and climate change. How significant would these groups be?
So again, so this is fundamentally what has happened. If you actually look, this has to be looked in a long URI kind of a format. Most of the liberal economies were very happy with China doing most of the manufacturing, and creating, basically becoming the factory. It makes sense until and unless rules of liberal interdependence were observed. This helped everyone. Absolutely everyone gained. China gained relatively more, but over a period of time, these capacities also provided China to coerce other states, especially when they are overly dependent upon China for some of the most critical elements, So rare earths, for that matter, is a critical resource needed in advanced technologies from mobiles to radars, so to say. And till 2012, China controlled over 90% of the market. One of the reasons for that was that nobody wanted to get into this dirty business because environmentally it's very, very hazardous to kind of, refine and extract rare earths is not, not in a sense, environment friendly. So China would do that. But if you remember the Senkaku Islands dispute between Japan and China in 2012, and it was the way China responded to it by cutting off rare earth supplies to Japan was a wake-up call. So over a period, China's monopoly in the market has been reduced to 60%, but still a monopoly, and it creates, it provides China with resources to kind of do economic coercion, which it did with India and Australia last year as well, and continues to do with Australia right now. Similar is the case with 5G technologies. Now, 5G technologies particularly allows China, if installed by these powers, would allow China some kind of backdoor entry into critical national security infrastructure, and again, provide instruments of coercion. So I think one of the reasons for doing this is to reduce your own vulnerability of not only your dependence on China, but at some point in time, China might use these capabilities to kind of actively coerce you. So it's just cutting down on your own vulnerabilities. That is fundamentally what is driving these kind of initiatives on rare earths and technology. Coming to climate change, I think climate change is something where everybody would need China. You can't really do anything without China on climate change. And China has committed to specific, measures regarding its commitment to taking upon climate change. But the Quad countries and the US would have to actively talk to China. There's no way out. And I think that also came out with the Anchorage talks between US and China. One of the rare things they agreed upon is basically on climate change. So I don't think that even when they want to kind of work, that's fine. They should. But they would have to rope in China at some point in time.
And finally, with all these developments, what lies ahead for the Quad Alliance? Do you think it is finally here to stay, irrespective of regime changes across these countries, if and when they happen?
Let me take the first question first, regime changes. We kind of attribute a lot of intention and motives to domestic politics and changes in domestic politics. But as far as I understand, domestic politics, if you take the example of India for that matter, might slow down the evolution of the Quad, but cannot fundamentally change the overall trajectory of geopolitical churning in the region. And primarily because it is much more dependent upon China's actions than any of these Quad countries. So China's rise, China's military assertiveness, China's economic coercion would fundamentally drive these countries to the Quad or extract these countries out of the Quad. So it is not as if, if China's behavior tomorrow, becomes much more acceptable, then Quad will continue to be in the same intensity. It might not be, but I don't see the reason for China to retract now. So that's the major problem. So insofar, the larger geopolitical structural incentives remain intact, I don't see domestic politics making a huge change in the trajectory of the Quad. It might slow it down, but it cannot change the overall trajectory. These countries are coming together out of existential needs. They are not coming towards each other for some lofty principles for that matter. They keep on saying rule of law, but at the end of the day, it's about maintaining American hegemony in the region, which basically serves the interest of all these powers. So everybody has similar interests. It's unlike BRICS, where you call multipolarity, but nobody knows the meaning of multipolarity. The only thing which all these countries share is fundamentally to avoid a Chinese hegemony in the region. And that's a very specific target. And something which they desperately require for their own for their own survival and existence. So I think that's completely separate in some sense, from issues like domestic politics. Though I'm not completely kind of saying that it doesn't matter, but the overall trajectory is set. The broader implications, if I may touch upon that, is that all these countries have finally, in some sense, have agreed to maintain the American hegemony. Whether you call it rule of law, whether you call it, the liberal principles, or whatever it is, but the American leadership or the leadership of liberal democracies must continue to kind of, influence the larger geopolitics in the region. I think that's one thing which easily one can take care of. One can take off in a sense. One might disagree or agree with India's level of democracy or something like that. And therefore, I don't see, these lofty ideals of democracy and all that primarily motivating it. It's primarily motivated by Chinese actions and Chinese assertiveness. And therefore, you can easily kind of, paper over, some of the differences which comes out of domestic politics. The second is that US has realized that it has to work more closely with its allies and partners, but that doesn't mean, man, the only problem I have is that the allies and partners should not piggyback upon American commitments. This is a larger problem, in a sense that if you look at the Trump administration, Japan, South Korea, Australia, India put a lot of effort into their military capabilities, and I don't want to see that these countries getting back into a state of limbo and saying that, oh, America will take care of. So that's the downside of working closely with allies and partners. In terms of the larger China policy, and you mentioned about anchorage, I think Biden's China policy is Trump plus. They cannot retract from the policy of confronting China until and unless it takes care of all the issues which Trump underlined. They have to stand up to China, but also extract more out of China for domestic credibility. So I think Biden is going to be much more taking a much more offensive approach to China compared to Trump, because of both geopolitical necessities, but also domestic politics. The US domestic politics has completely shifted. They need a middle class foreign policy, and for that, standing up to China is the way to go forward.
Thank you, Dr. Joshi, for this wonderful conversation. I think we all learned a lot from your answers today.
Thank you so much for the opportunity. Really very interesting set of questions. Made me think a lot. Thank you so much.
Thank you. You were listening to South Asia Chat. To learn more about our work, do visit us at isas.nus.edu.sg. Also follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and LinkedIn. Thank you.